A wounded Navy SEAL drove his old truck to a forgotten orchard in the far north, with only his loyal German shepherd beside him. He thought he was coming to claim a strange inheritance from a woman he barely remembered, but the land was hiding far more than apple trees and an old cabin. Because the woman who died did not leave him only a property. She left him a warning, a secret, and a reason he could not walk away. While everything around him looked peaceful enough to feel like a blessing, his dog Asher sensed something darker, as if the orchard itself was still guarding the truth. And as old war memories, hidden clues by the lake, and messages from the dead begin pulling him closer, Gideon realizes this place may change his life forever. This is not just a mystery story. It is a story about loyalty, second chances, healing, and the quiet ways God sometimes leads broken people home. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and after the story, leave your thoughts in the comments. And please like and subscribe to help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you more powerful stories. Morning in Duluth, Minnesota, came cold as unfinished steel. The harbor city lay under a pale gray sky, and Lake Superior looked less like water than a sheet of hammered metal stretched to the edge of the world. Wind came off the lake with a clean, merciless bite, rushing through half-empty parking lots, rattling shopping carts, scraping over old asphalt, and making every loose sign sound like a warning. It was the kind of cold that did not shout. It settled into bone and waited. Inside an aging pickup truck with faded blue paint and rust beginning to creep along the wheel wells, Gideon Vale opened his eyes. He woke the way soldiers wake even after the uniforms are gone. Suddenly, quietly, all at once. His back ached from sleeping at an angle against the driver's seat. Before he fully moved, his hand dropped by instinct toward the bench seat beside him. Asher was already awake. The German shepherd sat upright in the passenger seat, like a sentry carved out of patience and old loyalty. He was 4 or 5 years old, large and beautifully built, with a yellow and black coat, a clean dark saddle along his back, a deep black muzzle, and amber-brown eyes that seemed almost human in certain light. His ears were tall and alert. A worn dark leather collar circled his neck. He did not whine. He did not paw for attention. He only watched Gideon with that calm, unreadable steadiness that had, more than once, kept a bad morning from becoming a dangerous one. Gideon exhaled slowly and rubbed a hand over his face. He was 34, 6 feet tall, with a lean, compact strength that came from endurance rather than vanity. His face was clean-shaven, exposing the hard geometry of a square jaw and defined cheekbones. His dark brown hair was cut in a military style, a little longer than regulation, but still close enough to suggest that discipline had not entirely released its grip on him. His skin was light, but weathered by cold wind, bad sleep, and too many years outdoors. His eyes were gray-blue, the color of winter water, sharp even when tired. There was no softness in his posture, but there was wear. He pulled on his old olive-gray tactical combat shirt, the fabric softened by years of washing and work, faintly worn at the shoulders and cuffs. His earth-toned combat pants had gone pale at the knees. His boots were old military work boots, scarred and dependable. The old watch on his wrist still kept exact time, as if stubbornness could survive where faith had not. His life had not collapsed in a dramatic way. No fire, no public disgrace, no rock-bottom sermon waiting at the end of a bottle. It had simply come apart quietly. Gideon could work. He could fix things, lift things, guard things, drive things, haul things. Roofing 1 week, warehouse shifts the next. Night security when a manager was desperate enough. He was never fired because he was lazy. He was dismissed because people sensed something in him they could not name. He was too watchful, too silent, too quick to flinch at metal clanging against metal, too calm in moments when others panicked, and too tense in rooms where everybody else relaxed. Men like Gideon made civilians uneasy. He carried the atmosphere of a place where bad things had once happened fast. Asher jumped down first when Gideon opened the truck door. The dog landed lightly despite his size and stood close, glancing once across the lot, before looking back as if asking whether the day was going to behave itself. "Let's go," Gideon muttered. He took the dog to the narrow frozen strip of grass behind the grocery lot. Wind pressed against his shirt. Somewhere a cart banged against a curb, and his shoulders tightened before he could stop them. Asher returned immediately, touched his nose to Gideon's wrist, and held it there for 1 quiet second. It was enough. The tension loosened. That was how it always worked. Asher never made Gideon feel weak. The dog simply interrupted the worst moments before they could swallow the rest of the day. Gideon had once thought it was training. Later, he suspected it was love. Those two things often looked the same in the beginning. By late morning, hunger and habit led him to a roadside diner near the industrial stretch by the docks. The place was small, warm, and smelled of burnt coffee, bacon grease, and old kindness. Behind the counter stood the owner, Marlene Kessler, a woman in her late 50s with a strong frame, short silver blonde hair tucked behind one ear, and the pale, freckled skin of someone who had spent a life in northern weather. Her face was broad and honest, softened by laugh lines and sharpened by years of getting up before dawn. She had the brisk, capable manner of a woman who had long ago learned that sympathy should come with coffee, not speeches. "Mornin', Gideon," she said, already reaching for a mug. He nodded. "Morning." Marlene bent slightly to glance at Asher. "And mornin' to the handsome one. Still keeping you in line?" Asher gave her a calm look, then sat beside the booth as if politeness were part of his rank. "More than I deserve," Gideon said. That earned the smallest hint of a smile from her. She poured coffee and left the pot near him without asking. Marlene was one of the few people in Duluth who understood the difference between company and intrusion. She talked when talk helped. She let silence stand when it deserved the room. Gideon had barely taken 3 sips when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He stared at it, then answered. "Vale." A man's voice came through, measured and precise. "Mr. Gideon Vale? My name is Arthur Bell from Bell & Rowe, attorneys at law, Bayfield, Wisconsin. I'm calling regarding the estate of Miss Lenora Pike." Gideon's face remained blank. "You've got the wrong number." "I don't believe we do." Asher lifted his head from the floor. "There has been a formal bequest," the man continued. "Miss Pike named you as principal heir to a property in northern Wisconsin. A working orchard, attached structures, and adjoining lakeside land." Gideon let the silence stretch. Marlene glanced over from the counter. Not curious, just aware. "I don't know anyone named Lenora Pike," Gideon said at last. "There are documents verifying your identity through military records and secondary confirmation," Arthur Bell replied. "I understand this sounds unusual. If you wish, I can send you the relevant materials." "It sounds like fraud." "Then please review the materials before making any decision." Gideon ended the call. He sat still for a long moment, coffee cooling in his hand. The name meant nothing. The claim meant less. Yet something in the lawyer's voice had not felt sloppy enough for a scam. It had the careful weight of someone stepping across thin ice. Marlene came over with a plate of eggs and toast he had not ordered. "You look like somebody just mailed you a ghost," she said. "Maybe they did." Her brows rose slightly. "That bad?" "I don't know yet." She studied him for half a second, then nodded. "Well, eat first. Ghosts are easier with protein." The line was so dry it almost made him laugh, which irritated him enough to keep the feeling from showing. Marlene went back to the counter. Asher settled again, but not fully. One ear stayed turned toward Gideon. About an hour later, back in the truck, the email arrived. There were scanned documents, a death notice, a legal summary, photos of a property in Wisconsin, rows of young orchard trees, a long wooden cabin, a glass house catching evening sun, a weathered dock on a bright northern lake. Then there was a photograph of an older woman standing beside the greenhouse. Lenora Pike. She looked to be in her early 70s, slender, steady, silver blonde hair, tied low at the nape. A narrow, intelligent face marked by fine lines rather than softness, clear eyes, work-worn hands. She wore a faded field jacket over a blue shirt, the kind of clothes worn by people who cared more about weather and soil than appearances. And beneath the photo, one note from the legal file. Former civilian specialist in post-conflict agricultural restoration, Middle East deployment, 11 years prior. Something moved in Gideon's chest. Not memory exactly, more like pressure behind a locked door. Dust. Rotor wash. A scarf around a woman's throat. White grit blowing like snow through smoke. Someone shouting over the roar of an evacuation. A hand pushing a child forward. A valley torn open by gunfire. He shut the laptop. Asher, who had been lying quietly, suddenly stood and placed both front paws on the edge of the seat, staring at Gideon's face with unusual intensity. "Yeah," Gideon said softly. "I know." He called Mason Crowley. Mason had once been logistics support attached to Gideon's operational chain, a broad-shouldered man with a deep voice and the patient fatigue of someone who had spent too many years turning chaos into lists. Mason now worked private contracting in Iowa, but his memory for names and deployments was frighteningly clean. After a pause, Mason said, "Lenora Pike was real. Civilian side. Restoration program. Your team pulled survivors from an ambush route. That much I remember." "I don't remember her." "You don't remember F that year straight," Mason said, not unkindly. "But if she tracked you down through formal channels, she worked hard for it." Gideon looked out at the lake beyond the parking lot. Gray. Flat. Endless. "Lawyer says there's a sealed letter if I come in person." Mason was quiet for a beat. "Then I'd go." "I'm not chasing fate." "No," Mason replied. "Men like you never do. But you do chase unfinished things." That landed too close. By the time the sun leaned west, Gideon had made up his mind without admitting it to himself. He packed in silence. Duffel bag, dog food, water, 2 shirts, tools, paperwork. Asher watched every movement, then hopped into the truck before being told. Gideon was reaching for the driver's door when the dog froze. Not barked, not growled. Froze. His ears went forward, his eyes fixed on the far edge of the parking lot, where wind was pushing wrappers against a chain-link fence. There was nothing there. No person. No animal. Just gray afternoon and the low industrial groan of a harbor city. Then Asher let out one single, low sound from deep in his chest. Not fear, not warning exactly, but recognition. Gideon turned fast, pulse kicking hard. The fence rattled. A gull lifted. The lot stood empty again. For one strange second, it felt as though something had looked back. And that was the moment Gideon stopped thinking of the call as a mistake. He started the truck and headed east. The drive into northern Wisconsin stretched through long roads bordered by pine, birch, and open strips of water reflecting the evening sky. The farther he drove, the brighter the land seemed. Snow was gone, but the memory of it lingered in the air. Spring here did not arrive softly. It arrived like a careful truce. By the time Gideon turned onto the gravel road listed in the estate papers, the sun had dropped low enough to turn every window gold. The orchard appeared gradually, first the line of young trees, then the greenhouse gleaming pale in the slant of light, then the main cabin with its long front porch, and beyond that the old dock reaching toward a sheet of blue-silver water. It was beautiful in a way that hurt. Too still, too clear, too much like a place waiting to be loved by someone better than the man who had arrived. He put the truck in park. Asher. The dog did not move. He stood rigid on the passenger seat, ears high, amber eyes locked on the dark stand of pines behind the cabin. Gideon followed his gaze. The trees were motionless. The lake beyond them shone like polished steel. No one stood there. Nothing moved. Still, the feeling came over him at once. That ancient instinct that had kept him alive in places where hesitation meant burial. Something was wrong. Not loud wrong. Not obvious wrong. Quiet wrong. Eventually Asher jumped down, but only after a long pause. Even then he stayed close, body alert, nose working the air in careful pulls. That night, inside the cabin, Gideon opened the sealed letter left by Lenora Pike. The handwriting was thin and shaky, but deliberate. She wrote that she had not chosen him impulsively. She wrote that gratitude was only the beginning of the story, not the end of it. And then, near the bottom of the page, she left one line that made the room seem suddenly colder, though the fire had not gone out. If you truly came, do not be too quick to believe the past has sunk beneath the lake. Gideon read it twice. Then a soft wooden creak sounded from the porch. He lifted his head. Through the front window, one of the rocking chairs moved once, just once, as though someone had risen from it moments before he looked up. The first morning on Lenora Pike's land arrived with a kind of light Gideon had almost forgotten the world still knew how to make. It was cold light, clean light, northern light, pale gold pouring across the orchard rows and touching each bare branch as if the trees had been counted one by one during the night. Beyond the slope, the lake stretched bright and still beneath a washed blue sky. Birch trunks flashed white between the darker pines. The air smelled of thawing earth, wet wood, and the faint iron scent of cold water. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, Gideon felt like a man walking through a church where someone had whispered his name before he stepped through the door. He stood on the porch for a long moment, coffee untouched in his hand, old military watch cold against his wrist. His tactical shirt was still wrinkled from sleeping in it. Below him, Asher moved slowly along the edge of the steps, not playing, not wandering. The German shepherd's yellow and black coat caught the early sun in strips of gold and shadow. He was a large dog, strong through the shoulders, with a deep chest and a dark muzzle that gave him a permanent look of seriousness. His ears stayed pricked high. He sniffed the porch posts, the boards, the packed dirt below, then lifted his head toward the cabin windows as if measuring whether the house itself meant what it pretended to mean. Gideon understood the instinct. From a distance, the place looked almost too lovely to belong to grief. The orchard rolled down in disciplined rows. The greenhouse stood off to the side, its long glass walls glowing faintly in the morning. A weathered boathouse rested near the waterline. The main cabin was old but sturdy, built from timber gone silver in the northern winters, with a deep porch and a stone chimney that still held the dignity of use. But the closer he looked, the more he noticed what had stopped halfway. A bucket of pruning tools had been cleaned and arranged carefully near the shed, but one pair of shears still sat open, as if set down in the middle of a thought. The path to the greenhouse had been swept recently enough that no leaves gathered thickly there, yet one corner of the frame had been reinforced with temporary boards that no one had returned to replace. Seed notes were pinned in the kitchen, beside a hand-drawn planting calendar, but the dates stopped abruptly 3 months before the present week. The land had not been abandoned. It had been interrupted. That distinction sat heavily in him. Asher circled back and pressed his shoulder lightly against Gideon's leg. Gideon looked down. "Yeah," he murmured. "I see it." By late morning, the attorney arrived. Arthur Bell stepped out of a dark sedan with the careful stiffness of a man not used to muddy gravel roads. He was somewhere in his early 60s, tall and narrow through the chest, wearing a charcoal overcoat over a pressed shirt and dark tie. His silver hair was combed back neatly, and thin wire-rimmed glasses rested low on a long, composed face. He had no beard, only a deeply lined mouth and pale gray eyes that suggested a lifetime of reading painful facts aloud to strangers without turning cold. He shook Gideon's hand with professionalism rather than warmth, then bent politely to acknowledge Asher. "I've been told he is part of all major decisions," Arthur said. "He thinks he is," Gideon answered. Arthur gave the briefest flicker of a smile. "That may make him wiser than most heirs I meet." They sat at the kitchen table while sunlight fell across old wood scarred by decades of use. Arthur removed a file folder and began explaining the estate with a calm precision that made the strange business feel, for the first time, legally solid. Lenora Pike had named Gideon principal heir to the orchard property: greenhouse, main cabin, boathouse, and surrounding land. But Arthur clarified something important. Elliot Pike, Lenora's nephew, had not been left with nothing. Elliot had been given a smaller lakeside cabin on the far edge of the property, a modest trust, and legal standing to participate in management if Gideon ever declined the inheritance or chose to form a stewardship arrangement. That detail eased something in Gideon, though only slightly. Lenora had not made a reckless deathbed gesture. She had planned. Arthur folded his hands after finishing the summary. "Miss Pike was not an impulsive woman, Mr. Vale. So I'm learning. She anticipated that you might question her judgment." "I do." Arthur inclined his head as if that was the most reasonable answer possible. "Then perhaps that is one reason she chose you." After the signatures were done, Arthur took a key from a separate envelope and set it on the table. "She asked that you be given access to the West study after the formal transfer. She called it her private room. There are materials there she intended you to see." Something in Gideon's shoulders tightened. "Did she say why?" Arthur hesitated only briefly. "Only that some truths become easier to carry when a place is standing around them." It sounded like something a dying woman had told a lawyer who did not quite understand her, but had written the words down anyway, because they mattered to her. When Arthur left, the quiet returned all at once. It was deeper than silence in the city. Not empty, listening. Gideon took the key to the west study. The room was smaller than he expected. A writing desk sat beneath a window overlooking the orchard. Wooden shelves lined one wall. On another wall hung maps, old property surveys, rainfall charts, and sketches of irrigation plans. There were family photographs in simple frames. Lenora younger, standing beside rows of apple trees. Lenora beside an older man who looked like he might have been her father. A teenage boy Gideon assumed was Elliot, all elbows and stubbornness. The room smelled of cedar, paper, and the faint medicinal sweetness of dried herbs. He moved carefully, opening drawers, reading labels, letting his eyes adjust not to darkness, but to another person's order. At first there was nothing unusual. Seed catalogs, purchase invoices, handwritten orchard journals, rough expansion diagrams for the greenhouse. But then, between two folders of crop rotation notes, he found a photograph in a cracked plastic sleeve. Dust rose when he touched it. The image was old and poorly exposed, taken in the middle of motion. Several civilians were hunched low, running toward a helicopter. Smoke blurred the edges. One woman, younger by decades but unmistakably Lenora, had turned halfway back, one arm pulling a wounded child forward. Gideon stopped breathing for a moment. The memory did not return cleanly. It opened in splinters. Heat, then grit, then rotor wash whipping through white dust until the whole world looked filled with dirty snow. Someone screaming to move, a man down behind concrete. Lenora refusing to leave the child. Gideon shouting at her, gunfire cracking at an angle across the road. The feeling of grabbing a sleeve, hard enough to bruise. Then nothing. He sat down heavily in the chair. Asher had followed him in without a sound. The dog stood beside the desk now, watching Gideon's face with grave attention. "I remember her," Gideon said, though the words felt fragile. "Not enough, but I remember her." Inside the desk, he found a small cassette recorder labeled in neat handwriting with a date from only weeks before Lenora's death. He pressed play. The tape hissed softly before her voice emerged. Aged, tired, but steady. Lenora Pike sounded like a woman who had learned how to ration her strength without surrendering her will. She said she knew Gideon might mistrust her choice. She said she had not chosen him only because he had once saved her life. After returning to the United States, she had quietly searched for the identity of the soldier who pulled her and the child into the evacuation transport. When she eventually found his name, she did not contact him right away. She believed some survivors had no right to reopen what they themselves had escaped. But she watched from a respectful distance where she legally could. Through veterans' assistance networks. Through public records. Through a program that supported retired working dogs and the handlers who took them in. She knew he struggled. She knew he drifted. She knew there were years where he almost vanished from ordinary life. Then her voice softened. "But I also learned," she said, "that when the world stopped making room for you, you still had a room for the dog." Gideon stared at the recorder. She continued, "A man may break in many places and still keep his center. A man who feeds, shelters, and stays gentle with a loyal creature after losing nearly everything has not broken all the way through." The sentence went into him like a nail set carefully into wood. He looked at Asher, who had lowered himself to the floor beside the desk, head up, eyes steady. For years, Gideon had measured his failures in jobs lost, places left, Nights survived badly. It had not occurred to him that someone else might have measured him by the fact that he had not failed the one living being who depended on him. For a long time, he did not move. At some point in that silence, Asher rose. He crossed the room without hurry and went to the stone wall near the fireplace in the adjoining sitting room. There he stopped and inhaled slowly, deeply, nose close to the seam where timber met stone. He did it again and again, not like a dog chasing mice, not like curiosity, like recognition. Gideon stood and followed. "What is it?" Asher did not bark. He did not scratch. He simply stayed fixed at the same section of wall, body tense, tail low, breathing through his nose with deliberate intensity. Then he stepped back and looked at Gideon. The look was brief, but something in it landed under Gideon's ribs with the old, unreasonable certainty of superstition. Someone had stood there often. Not years ago, not in some vague past. Often. And not long enough ago. A place that had belonged to a dying woman was beginning to feel as though it had also belonged, in secret, to someone who had no right to be inside it. The feeling followed Gideon into the afternoon. He made himself keep moving. Motion had always been his way through uncertainty. He walked the edge of the greenhouse, checking patched corners. He inspected the shed. He followed the path down toward the lake with Asher at his side. The boathouse leaned slightly, but remained sound. The dock boards were weathered silver, their grain raised by years of freezing and thawing. The lake beyond was so still it looked unreal, a polished sheet of blue glass laid across the earth by some enormous, patient hand. No waves, no birds on the surface, no wind strong enough to ruffle it. The beauty of it was almost unbearable. Asher's pace changed. He moved in front of Gideon and stopped. Every muscle in the dog's body tightened. His ears went high. His gaze fixed not on the shoreline, not on the trees, but farther out, toward a section of water where the reflection of the sky seemed unnaturally perfect. Gideon stopped too. "What do you see?" Asher did not answer, except by remaining exactly where he was, blocking Gideon's next step with quiet insistence. Gideon waited. After a few seconds, the feeling came again, that primitive pressure at the base of the neck that had once told him when a road was wrong, when a rooftop was watched, when a silence held intention rather than peace. He looked at the water and saw nothing. That was what troubled him. On the walk back to the cabin, the place no longer felt merely inherited. It felt entrusted, and somewhere beneath that, warned. As dusk settled, he returned to the study and began going through the orchard journals one by one. Most were practical. Weather notes, bloom dates, fertilizer calculations, pest observations. But tucked between 2 pages of irrigation figures, he found a loose slip of paper in Lenora's handwriting. It was only one sentence. "If anyone asks what I feared most, tell them not to look at the woods. Tell them to look at the lake when it is too calm." Gideon read it twice, then set it down. Outside, evening slid across the property in slow blue layers. The orchard darkened branch by branch. Somewhere a board creaked. Somewhere farther off, something moved once through grass. Night came full. He made a simple meal, fed Asher, checked the doors, and told himself he was being ridiculous. A dead woman's notes and a dog's instincts did not amount to evidence. They amounted to atmosphere. And atmosphere was dangerous because it let the mind write stories where facts had not yet earned them. Still, he took the flashlight with him when Asher suddenly lifted his head near midnight. The dog was not barking. He was listening. Then came the sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps at the far edge of the orchard. Not many, just enough to say human. Gideon moved fast, the old instincts flowing into him before thought did. He crossed the porch, boots hitting dirt softly, flashlight already in hand. Asher raced ahead in silence, low and fast through the trees. By the time Gideon reached the edge of the rows, the sound had stopped. The flashlight beam swept across grass, trunks, the dark drop toward the lake. Nothing. Then he saw Asher standing beside a patch of fresh-turned soil near the outer border of the orchard. The dog had scraped one paw through the loose earth and now held still, staring down. Gideon crouched. Half exposed in the dirt lay a piece of tarnished metal, old and dark with age. He picked it up and felt his pulse change at once. A cartridge casing, not rusted beyond recognition, not recent either. But wrong. Wrong for local hunters. Wrong for a lakeside orchard. Wrong in a way only a man who had spent years learning the language of weapons would notice immediately. The wind shifted through the trees. Asher stood close beside him, eyes on the darkness beyond the beam. Gideon closed his hand around the casing and slowly rose. The orchard around him looked black and endless, the lake somewhere beyond it lying flat and mute beneath the stars. For the first time since arriving, he knew with certainty that Lenora Pike had not died carrying only memories. She had died carrying fear, and somehow, impossibly, she had left part of that fear in his hands. The days that followed did not unfold like a miracle. They unfolded like work. By morning, the orchard could look almost holy. Sunlight spilled down the slope in long, bright bands, touching the rows of young apple trees until each branch seemed outlined in pale fire. The greenhouse caught the early light and turned it soft. The glass fogged from inside with the breath of damp soil and living roots. Beyond everything, the lake held the sky with such perfect composure that it looked painted, too still to trust and too beautiful to accuse. But beauty, Gideon was learning, did not mean ease. By the third day, he had a legal folder on the kitchen table, a list of necessary repairs folded into his pocket, and a low headache that had settled behind his eyes from trying to learn too many things at once. The greenhouse heater worked only when it pleased. One section of the irrigation line had lost pressure somewhere underground. A corner of the orchard showed signs of canker in the bark. The smaller lakeside cabin leaned just enough to make him suspicious of its foundation. Property taxes had been kept barely ahead of overdue, and several invoices for maintenance sat bundled neatly with twine, as if Lenora had intended to return to them on a better morning that never came. If this place was fate, fate had a crooked sense of humor. Asher stayed close through all of it. The German Shepherd moved differently here than he had in parking lots and city edges. Not looser, exactly. More attentive in layers. He patrolled the orchard rows with his nose low and his ears sharp, then doubled back to check on Gideon as though making sure the man had not disappeared while the dog was handling the perimeter. At times, Asher seemed almost irritated by the number of things in need of watching. Wind through the pines, distant engine sounds from the road, the greenhouse vents, the boathouse, the lake itself. Gideon understood that feeling, too. Late that morning, a pickup truck rolled up the gravel drive. The man who climbed out was broad through the shoulders and built like somebody who had spent 40 years lifting whatever the day required without once calling it exercise. Wes Harlan looked to be in his late 50s, maybe pushing 60, with sun-darkened skin and heavy hands knotted by labor. His face was rectangular and weather-cut, his nose slightly bent from an old break that had healed without vanity. Gray-brown stubble shadowed his jaw, and his hair, what remained of it, was clipped short beneath a faded cap. He wore a worn red-brown flannel under a canvas work jacket, brown work pants stained with grease and soil, and boots that had known more seasons than some marriages. He stood for a second by his truck, taking Gideon in with the careful reserve of a man who did not waste first impressions on charm. "You Vale?" he asked. "Gideon." Wes nodded once. "Wes Harlan. Helped Lenora keep the place running when she couldn't be everywhere herself." His voice was low and rough, not unfriendly, but built to carry over tractors and bad weather. Asher approached him at once. Not aggressive, not warm, just direct. Wes let the dog come close enough to sniff his hand, though something in his eyes tightened. Not fear, discomfort. The sort that belonged to a man who didn't mind animals but minded what they noticed. "Smart dog," Wes said. "He usually is." Wes glanced toward the greenhouse, then the orchard, then the smaller cabin farther down the slope. "You got more on your hands here than a dead woman's nice intentions." "I figured that out." That earned the nearest thing to approval Gideon had seen from him. They spent the next hour walking the property. Wes knew the place the way old mechanics know the sound of an engine they no longer own. He pointed out the heater unit that short-cycled when the nights dropped too cold, the line of pipe that likely had a leak under the western field, the weak roof seam over the side storage shed, the bee boxes that would need inspection once the weather steadied. He knew names of suppliers, names of neighboring landowners, names of men who sharpened blades and fixed pumps and overcharged for lumber. He also knew things he did not say directly. At the back fence, Wes crouched to inspect a section of wire. "This didn't happen from winter," he said. Gideon looked down. The cut was clean, tool-made. "You know who did it?" Wes stood slowly. "If I knew, I'd say I had a theory. I don't, so I'll say it's strange." It was the kind of answer that did not lie and did not help. When they reached the boathouse, Gideon noticed fresh tire tracks stamped into the damp soil nearby. Too narrow for Wes's truck. Too recent to belong to Lenora's old vehicle, which had been sitting unused in the side barn since before he arrived. Wes noticed Gideon looking. "Not mine," he said before being asked. Gideon said nothing. The older man rubbed a hand over his jaw. "There's been talk." "What kind of talk?" "That some investor out of Ashland's been sniffing around shoreline properties, private cabins, retreat development, rich people who like nature as long as it comes with railings and heated floors." "I'm not selling." Wes looked at him then, more directly than before. "Might want to decide that loud enough for folks to hear." There was no threat in it. Only weather. After Wes left, Gideon drove into town for supplies. Bayfield was the sort of northern town that looked picturesque until you stared long enough to see where the paint had cracked. Tourist charm at the front, local fatigue behind it. The feed and supply store stood on the edge of town in a squat wooden building with a faded green sign and a porch cluttered with fertilizer bags, rakes, salt blocks, and seed trays. Inside, the air smelled of rubber boots, grain dust, cold metal, and coffee that had sat on a warmer since dawn. Behind the counter stood June Mercer. She was in her late 30s, maybe, with a compact athletic build and the easy balance of someone used to lifting 50-pound sacks without making it look like a statement. Her brown hair, touched with copper where the sun caught it, was tied back in a loose knot at the nape of her neck. A few strands had slipped free around a narrow face marked by faint freckles across the bridge of her nose. Her eyes were hazel with a green cast to them, sharp enough to make most people confess things they had not intended to say. She wore a pale thermal Henley beneath a tan work jacket, dark jeans and scuffed boots. Nothing about her was ornamental. Everything about her suggested precision. "You're the new man at Pike Orchard," she said before Gideon reached the counter. He set a box of fittings down. "Word moves fast. In a town this size, a wrong dog bark and a strange truck get discussed before lunch." She looked past him to Asher. "That your shepherd?" "Yeah." June studied the dog with a kind of professional respect. "Good eyes, calm mouth. That's a useful combination." She rang up the fittings, heater filters, greenhouse tape, gloves, and pipe seal without hurrying. She asked what heater model Lenora had been using, what pressure drop he was seeing, which row the bark damage was on. By the time Gideon answered the third question, he realized she was not making conversation. She was measuring the rhythm of the orchard through him. "You worked with Lenora?" he asked. "Supplied her," June said. "Sometimes advice if she was willing to pretend it was her own." A small smile touched one corner of her mouth. She was good at that. "Anything I should know?" June looked at him in a way that was not flirtation and not challenge. It was appraisal. "She bought some things odd hours toward the end," she said. "Nothing illegal, just off-pattern. Deliveries after dark, orders not listed in the routine account book. Extra fuel, spare glass latches, lock hardware. Like somebody expected either weather or trouble and wasn't sure which would arrive first." Gideon held her gaze. "You tell the sheriff?" June's expression did not change, but her voice cooled by a degree. "Around here, people don't report instincts. They save that for facts." Then, after a beat, she added, "And they don't much like strangers digging up what everyone else has learned to step around." That stayed with him all the way back to the orchard. The wind came up hard that afternoon. Gideon was behind the greenhouse checking warped floorboards along the rear storage platform when Asher suddenly trotted past him, stopped, doubled back, then placed one paw on a narrow section of wood near the corner seam. Not scratching. Pressing. Gideon frowned. "What?" The dog stepped off, then on again in the same place. Gideon knelt and tapped the board. Hollow. For a second, neither of them moved. Wind pushed against the greenhouse glass with a low, uneasy hum. Somewhere above, a vent rattled once and went still. It was such a small discovery, one board sounding wrong among dozens. But the moment had the strange hush of a hand touching a hidden latch in an old story. Gideon pried the panel up carefully. Below it lay a shallow storage compartment lined in tar paper and cedar planks. Inside were seed envelopes sealed in waxed sleeves, rolls of greenhouse mesh, spare irrigation gauges, 2 binders of orchard planning notes, and a thick packet of hand-drawn diagrams. No gold, no confession, no convenient answer. But beneath the practical things was something else, a plan large enough to belong to a future. Gideon sat back on his heels and stared. Lenora had not been preserving a small orchard out of sentiment. She had been building toward something. He carried the binders into the kitchen and read until late afternoon light shifted from gold to blue. The notes were meticulous. Crop rotations, pollinator corridors, expansion plans for the greenhouse into medicinal herbs and winter starts, rotating cabins for seasonal recovery stays, budget sketches for refurbishing the smaller lodge. Then deeper into the pages, the vision widened. Lenora wanted the land to become more than productive. She wanted it to become useful in the oldest human way, a place where labor itself might help put damaged people back into rhythm. There were pages outlining short rural stays for veterans with service dogs, notes on orchard work, soil therapy, beekeeping, quiet lodging, and walking paths designed not for tourists, but for men and women who no longer trusted crowds. Gideon read one line 3 times. A place for those who cannot yet live loudly, but still deserve to live well. He leaned back in the chair and looked toward the window, where Asher moved between the rows like a dark gold spirit keeping order among bare trees. No one had ever built anything with him in mind before. The thought made him angrier than it should have, because beneath the anger was grief. Toward evening, he walked the property again with the binder's maps fresh in his head. That was when he found the old trail. It ran from the far edge of the pines down toward a low strip near the water line, a path faint but real, packed by repeated use. It did not appear on the property survey Arthur had left. It was narrow enough to avoid notice unless a man was looking for what did not belong. At the shore end of it, half hidden behind brush, stood a weathered mooring post driven into the ground years ago. The post was not old enough to be original to the orchard. Someone had made practical use of reaching the lake from the woods without passing by the house. Asher sniffed the base of the post, then lifted his head sharply toward the road, as though tracking an old story on the wind. Gideon followed the direction of his gaze but saw only evening settling over the land. Back in the cabin after dark, rain began, a fine, cold drizzle tapping softly against the roof and windows. Gideon spread Lenora's papers across the kitchen table, trying to force the pieces into one shape. Repairs, vision, missing time, off-book supplies, cut fence wire, tire tracks, an unmapped path, a cartridge casing in fresh soil. Too many small things. Not enough truth. The power flickered once, then again. Asher rose from the rug and stood facing the hallway. The lights went out. For a moment there was only the rain, the dark outline of the kitchen window, and the soft sound of the dog breathing. Then, from the west study, a mechanical click. Gideon turned. A second later, through the darkness, the old tape recorder came alive on its own after the briefest pulse of returning current. Static hissed. Then Lenora's voice emerged, thin and distant, as though traveling upward through deep water. Gideon, if you found this room open, then I did not finish the rest. The tape cut off. Not naturally, not with the soft drag of a dying battery or the blunt end of a recording. It stopped like something had once reached over and forced it to end there. Gideon stood motionless in the dark, rain whispering on the roof above him, while Asher stared down the hall with every line of his body drawn tight. The orchard around them lay hidden under rain and night, beautiful as ever. And for the first time, Gideon understood that beauty could be the neatest cover a secret ever asked for. Rain left the orchard smelling of bark, cold soil, and wet cedar the next morning. The storm from the night before had passed, but the land still held its breath in that strange northern way. Bright sky above, damp silence below, as if beauty and trouble had signed a temporary truce. Gideon stood at the kitchen table with Lenora's papers spread in uneven stacks around him. Diagrams, invoices, orchard notes, the partial recording, and the list he had begun making in his own blunt handwriting. Heater, west line pressure, fence cut, shore trail, tire tracks, cartridge casing. The list looked absurd in daylight. That was the problem with mystery. At 3 in the morning it felt like prophecy. At 9:30 with coffee cooling beside your hand, it looked like a man making enemies out of weather and old grief. Asher lay near the door, head up, eyes half-lidded, but never fully resting. The German shepherd's yellow and black coat still held a faint, damp sheen from the morning air. He had the disciplined stillness of a trained dog and the deeper patience of an animal who had decided long ago that his person was worth the inconvenience of guarding. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the quiet. Gideon stepped onto the porch and saw a truck he did not recognize, an old dark green Ford with rust at the wheel wells and a cracked passenger mirror tied in place with black tape. The driver's door opened hard, and a man climbed out with the stiff, irritated energy of someone who had spent the whole drive rehearsing what he planned to say. Elliot Pike was younger than Gideon by a few years, maybe 31 or 32, lean to the point of angularity, with the kind of frame that suggested missed meals rather than discipline. He stood around 6 feet tall, but looked taller because everything about him ran narrow. Shoulders, hips, face. His cheekbones were sharp. His mouth was thin and habitually tight, as though life had trained it to expect disappointment. He wore a faded denim jacket over a dark Henley, old work jeans and boots cracked pale at the toes. His hair was brown with a touch of dull gold in it, grown a little too long to be neat, and his eyes were blue-gray like lake water under cloud. There was no beard, only a shadow of neglect across his jaw. He had the face of a man who had once been handsome easily and now carried that fact like a debt he could no longer pay. He looked first at the house, then the orchard, then at Gideon. "So," Elliot said, "you're real." His voice was roughened by cigarettes, bad sleep, and the habit of keeping anger warm. "That seems to be the rumor," Gideon answered. Elliot's gaze sharpened. "Funny. No one said it had to be." For a second it looked like Elliot might step forward just to create collision where words were not enough. Instead, he glanced down as Asher came to stand beside Gideon. The dog did not bark. He simply positioned himself at Gideon's leg and watched Elliot with calm, unsmiling attention. Elliot let out a breath through his nose. "She left it to you. I still can't decide if that's cruel, insane, or just my family's favorite way of apologizing too late." Gideon could have answered with hardness. It would have been easy. But the man in front of him did not look like a thief who had arrived to snatch something. He looked like a son of the place who had returned to find his childhood renamed. "You want to come in?" Gideon asked. That surprised Elliot more than if Gideon had threatened him. Inside, the tension stayed, but it changed shape. Elliot moved through the kitchen and sitting room with the strange, restrained hunger of someone revisiting a house that used to know him by heart. He touched nothing at first, just looked. The old cast-iron stove, the shelf with Lenora's jars, the window over the sink that faced the slope. Then he stopped by the doorframe and ran his thumb over a set of faint pencil lines cut into the wood. "She marked my height here," he said quietly. "Every fall, right before harvest." His voice did something then, softened for one sentence, then shut again like a door remembering it was supposed to stay locked. They sat at the table. Gideon told him what Arthur Bell had explained about the will. Elliot listened without interrupting, though anger moved across his face in small, sharp flashes. "She gave me the lower cabin and a trust," Elliot said at last. "A pity package with decent legal formatting. She didn't cut you out." "No," Elliot laughed once without humor. "She just chose somebody else first." There it was. Not greed, not simple resentment. The old, ugly wound beneath both. Rejection. Piece by piece, and mostly because silence became heavier than speech, Elliot told him enough to matter. He had grown up spending every summer here. Lenora had taught him how to prune young trees, how to judge weather by the underside of clouds, how to leave bees alone when his temper was bad. After his mother died, the orchard became the only place that still felt arranged in a way grief could tolerate. Later came debts, dumb friends, a failed equipment deal, and the slow humiliation of needing money faster than dignity grows back. A developer had once offered him a way out if he could help persuade Lenora to sell shoreline access. He had tried. She had seen exactly what desperation had made him willing to trade. She never forgave that, Elliot said. Gideon looked at him across the table. You sure? Elliot's mouth twisted. No, that's the problem. She might have. Lenora loved people in ways that made you feel smaller, not bigger. They were still sitting there when another vehicle came up the drive. This one moved slower. A county sheriff's SUV, clean enough to belong to a man who respected appearances. Sheriff Nolan Reed stepped out with the easy posture of someone accustomed to entering other people's trouble as though he had been invited. He was in his early 50s, tall and square-shouldered, not bulky, but solidly built. His uniform sat on him too well to look casual. Everything about him was orderly. Dark tan shirt, pressed clean, badge polished, belt exact, boots barely dusted despite the road. His hair was brown, gone silver at the temples, clipped close. His face was broad, clean-shaven, and composed, with a mouth that smiled without revealing much and eyes that were clear, pale, and unpleasantly patient. He climbed the porch steps and removed his hat in a gesture polite enough to belong in another century. Mr. Vale, he said, heard we had a new resident at Pike Orchard. Thought I'd stop by, introduce myself, make sure there weren't any questions about property boundaries, seasonal access, shoreline regulations. Folks tend to appreciate a little clarity up here. His voice was even, warm in precisely measured doses. Asher moved before Gideon did. The dog stepped in front of Gideon's left leg and stood there, not stiff, not aggressive, just undeniably present. His ears tilted slightly forward. His eyes never left Nolan's face. The sheriff noticed. Of course he noticed. Well now, Nolan said lightly, he takes his job serious. He usually has a reason, Gideon answered. Nolan's smile held. That's so. He gave Elliot a glance, one that landed on the younger man and passed on with no visible judgment. Elliot. Sheriff. No warmth there either. Nolan spoke about practical things, easements, winter road maintenance, occasional trespassers cutting across shoreline properties. Then, almost casually, he said, managing land that size alone can get expensive. There's no shame in deciding a commercial offer makes more sense than sentiment, especially if you're not from here. The line was gentle enough to pass in daylight. Still, Gideon felt something cold under it. I'll keep that in mind, he said. Nolan replaced his hat. Do that. He left with the same neat calm he had arrived in. The engine noise faded. Only when the road went quiet again did Asher relax and move away from Gideon's leg. Elliot watched the dog, then the road, then Gideon. He always make your shepherd do that? No. That should bother you. It does. The rest of the afternoon slid under tension like a blade under cloth. Gideon tried to work, but his mind kept snagging on details. Nolan too smooth. Elliot too angry to be fake. Lenora changing locks. Off-book orders. The unmapped trail to the lake. And beneath all of it, the old war memory shifting again. It came not as a vision, but as a sequence of triggers. The smell of machine oil from the boathouse lamp. A loose sheet of metal rattling against the shed wall in the wind. One of Lenora's photographs turned upside down on the study desk. Each thing struck the same place inside him. Dust and rotor wash. The child bleeding from the shoulder. Lenora shouting over gunfire. Not his name. A man's name. He almost had it. Almost. Then the memory slammed shut, leaving behind the ugly aftertaste of adrenaline and failure. By evening, Ruth Pike arrived. She came in a faded blue station wagon that looked old enough to have attended funerals without help. Ruth was somewhere in her mid-70s, a small woman with a straight back and a face made fine rather than frail by age. Her white hair was twisted into a neat low knot. Her skin was pale and lined delicately, like folded paper kept too close to light. Her eyes were a washed, intelligent gray-blue, and they missed very little. She wore a thick cardigan the color of weathered cedar over a cream blouse, a dark skirt, and sensible shoes built for ice and church floors. She gave the impression of a woman who had long ago learned that gentleness and weakness were not remotely related. She kissed Elliot on the cheek, despite his stiffness, then turned to Gideon. "So," she said, "you're the man Lenora trusted with my family's headache." There was wit in it, and sorrow, and no attempt at politeness for its own sake. Over supper, because Ruth insisted nobody should discuss inheritance on an empty stomach, she told them what neither legal paper nor grief had yet said clearly enough. Lenora had loved Elliot fiercely. She had not turned from him because of one bad decision. She had stepped back because she believed the orchard needed someone who would not sell tomorrow to survive this week. Lenora did not despise desperation. She despised what desperation made permanent. "She never stopped making room for you," Ruth told Elliot quietly. "She stopped trusting the version of you that thought panic was a business plan." Elliot stared into his coffee, jaw tight. Then Ruth turned to Gideon. "In her last year," she said, "Lenora changed locks 3 times, kept curtains drawn after dark, wouldn't go near the dock once evening came down, and one night, when she thought she heard something outside, she told me if anything happened, I was not to let the sheriff find everything first." The room went still. Elliot looked up sharply. "Why didn't you tell me that before?" Ruth answered with a blunt honesty that made her seem taller. "Because you were half a bottle from ruin most days then, and I wasn't about to place fear into hands that couldn't hold a coffee cup steady." No one spoke for several moments after that. By then the sky had gone violet outside, and wind from the lake had risen again, knocking softly under the dock planks like a patient fist. Later, after Ruth left and Elliot took the lower cabin key in silence, Gideon walked down to the water with Asher. The evening had that strange silver quality northern lakes sometimes wear when sunset refuses to commit either to warmth or darkness. Boards under the dock were still damp from the previous rain, and the wind pushed against them in uneven breaths. Gideon knelt near a section that had started lifting at one corner. Asher came beside him, sniffed once beneath the warped board, then scratched at a narrow seam and stopped. Not frantic, not digging, indicating. Gideon wedged a pry bar under the loosened plank and lifted. Inside the shallow cavity lay a rusted tin box wrapped once in oilcloth, gone stiff with age. He drew it out carefully. The hinges complained. Inside were 3 things: An old photograph of Lenora standing by the lake with a younger man Gideon did not recognize. Several blurred photocopies of military logistics pages, too faded to read cleanly, but marked with routing numbers and partially blacked out names, and a single folded note. Gideon opened it under the failing light. The handwriting was Lenora's. Do not let Reed get the blue notebook. For one sharp second, the name in Gideon's memory flashed like current across wet wire. Not a full memory, not proof, but enough to make his pulse strike hard once against his throat. He looked out across the darkening lake, the note crackling softly in his hand, while Asher stood beside him staring toward the tree line as if the night itself had just moved. The note from the tin box did not make the room louder. It made everything quieter. For the rest of that evening, Gideon moved through the cabin with the folded scrap of Lenora's handwriting in his pocket, like it had weight enough to pull him off balance. Do not let Reed get the blue notebook. Not a notebook. The blue notebook. Something specific. Something Lenora had expected might outlive her. Something important enough to name, but not important enough, or perhaps not safe enough, to leave in the cabin where ordinary searching could find it. Asher stayed close, drifting from doorway to window to Gideon's side with the grave patience of a dog who had learned that danger often came disguised as waiting. The shepherd's yellow and black coat caught the kitchen lamplight in warm bands, but his eyes remained watchful. He had not relaxed since the dock. Elliot returned after dark from the lower cabin carrying a flashlight, a half-dead phone, and the defensive exhaustion of a man who hated needing anyone. He looked worse in low light. His narrow face seemed more cut by shadow, his jaw tighter, the fatigue beneath his eyes more obvious. But some of the bitterness had shifted shape. He was still angry, still raw, yet there was now another emotion mixed into it. Something less convenient and more dangerous. Concern. He tossed the flashlight onto the table. You planning to tell me if Reed's name is on that note? Or am I supposed to keep guessing until somebody shoots the dog? Gideon looked up sharply. Elliot rubbed a hand over his mouth. Bad choice of words. Yeah, Gideon said. For a moment, neither man spoke. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. Somewhere in the walls, old timbers clicked as the temperature dropped. Then Gideon unfolded the note and handed it across. Elliot read it once and swore under his breath. Not loudly. Not theatrically. More like a man finding rot in a beam he'd hoped would hold. You really think she meant Sheriff Reed? She knew his name. She wrote it. Gideon leaned back against the counter. That's not proof, but it's not nothing. Elliot stared at the paper another second, then set it down carefully, as if even his anger knew better than to damage the dead woman's final warnings. Lenora kept one little notebook with her every winter. Blue cover, cloth binding, beat up around the corners. I used to think it was just weather notes. You ever read it? She never let me. Said if I was curious, I should become more useful. For the first time that day, a thin ghost of humor moved through the room and vanished again. By morning, cooperation had arrived not as trust, but as necessity. June Mercer came out just after 10, driving an old black Jeep with salt scars along the fenders. She stepped from it in her work jacket and dark jeans, hair tied back, hands shoved into her pockets against the cold. In daylight, she looked even more exacting than she had in the supply store. Lean, alert, capable of noticing the difference between what someone said and what they meant. She listened while Gideon laid out the note, the partial records, and the pattern of strange deliveries Lenora had made. June's expression barely shifted, but her eyes sharpened in small increments, like a lens turning toward focus. "Lenora used 2 accounts with me near the end," she said. "One for orchard business, one cash whenever she didn't want routine paperwork connected to the order. Still normal enough if she was planning something private. What wasn't normal was timing." She pulled a small spiral book from her jacket pocket and flipped through her own store notes, written in a narrow, tight hand. Twice she had materials dropped down by the shoreline instead of the drive. One delivery came after dusk in January, another during lake freeze when most people with good sense stay home. Elliot frowned. "What kind of materials?" "Latches, weatherproof document sleeves, fuel stabilizer, replacement lantern parts, one portable heater. Nothing dramatic." "That's what makes it worse." "Why?" Gideon asked. June met his eyes. "Because nobody hides obvious things. They hide things that can pass for ordinary." That afternoon they brought Wes Harlan back into the circle. He arrived reluctantly, carrying the defensive stoicism of a man who had spent too many years keeping company with regret. In the bright light, he looked older than before. The red in his face came not from drink, but from weather and labor. His thick hands stayed busy with the brim of his cap, the cuff of his jacket, the table edge, small movements betraying a nervousness his expression refused to show. When Gideon mentioned the blue notebook, Wes went still in a way that meant memory had struck before intention. "I never saw it open," he said after a long silence, "but I knew it existed." "You helped move her records," Gideon pressed. Wes nodded once. "A few boxes, old invoices, some maps, some family things. She wanted them out of the main cabin. Said some eyes around here followed paper closer than they followed church sermons." "Did she tell you who she was afraid of?" "No." Wes's mouth tightened. "And before you ask, yes. I should have pushed harder. I didn't. Had my own family, my own reasons to keep my head down." June watched him carefully. Elliot looked disgusted. Gideon, more than anyone else at the table, understood what fear could make respectable people call prudence. Still, understanding did not soften the consequences. "What do you know about the shoreline path?" Gideon asked. Wes sighed through his nose. "Old service access years back. Not official. Useful if a man wanted to come in from the water without every neighbor seeing." "For orchard work?" "For whatever needed not being noticed." The answer sunk between them like bad weather. It was Asher who broke the stalemate. The German shepherd had been lying near the back door, listening with his whole body the way some dogs do when human tension changes the air. Then, without warning, he got to his feet and went to the porch. He did not bark to be let out. He looked back once at Gideon, then scratched once, sharply, against the wood. Gideon opened the door. Asher moved fast but not wildly, cutting across the yard toward the tree line at the far edge of the orchard. Not the dock, not the greenhouse. Farther north, toward a section of land Gideon had barely inspected because it was half choked with undergrowth and one old pine split long ago by lightning. "Where's he going?" Elliot said, already grabbing a coat. No one answered. They followed. Wind moved cold through the trees. Blossoms shook loose overhead and drifted pale across the ground like late snow. Asher stopped at the base of the split pine, nose low, circling once. Then he stood at one patch of earth and looked up at Gideon. Not urgent, not dramatic, simply certain. For one strange heartbeat, standing there beneath a broken tree while white petals turned through the air, Gideon felt the same sensation he had once felt before stepping onto roads in war zones. Not fear, exactly, but the sense that the ground beneath him was trying to speak, and only one creature among them already understood the language. It took the better part of half an hour to dig. The soil was packed with roots and stones. Elliot cursed under his breath. June worked without complaint, methodical and grim. Wes used the shovel like a man punishing both dirt and memory. Gideon dug hardest of all. At last, metal struck metal. What they hauled out was not a box, but a cylindrical storage canister, weatherproofed and heavy, wrapped once in decayed canvas. The lid had rust around the rim, but the seal held. Inside lay a cloth-bound notebook, the color of faded navy. The blue notebook. At first it seemed disappointing. No confession, no list of names, no final revelation written in righteous fury. Just pages of practical notation in Lenora's small, disciplined hand. Weather marks, supply colors, lake freeze depths, delivery dates, lantern fuel counts, codes tied to tree rows and shoreline points. It resembled a field ledger more than a secret archive. Elliot flipped a few pages and let out a bitter laugh. We dug up farming. June took the book from him. No, she said quietly. We dug up disguise. Back in the cabin, they worked through it together. June cross-checked the dates against her store notes. Wes recognized dock usage patterns and shoreline references. Elliot remembered when Lenora stayed unusually late by the boathouse or sent him away from chores. Gideon stared at the coded symbols until something old and half-buried began to stir in the back of his mind. Logistics shorthand. Not military in any official sense, but close enough in rhythm to it. Abbreviations built for people who expected eyes other than their own to pass over the page. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. During winter, when the lake froze thick enough and the roads drew less attention than the ice, Lenora's shoreline had been used as a quiet transfer point. Small loads. Nothing that would attract large-scale suspicion. Equipment parts, fuel, sealed packets disguised among orchard materials, paperwork hidden inside harmless freight. Later entries suggested Lenora had realized the work was not just local smuggling. Some of it connected back to leftovers from wartime supply corruption, things that had gone astray in regions where oversight died before greed did, then resurfaced years later in more modest but still poisonous form. A local link, not a grand conspiracy. Worse in a way, because it fit the town, the roads, the lake. Evil small enough to live among regular people. Near the back of the notebook, tucked between two pages, was a loose sheet in Lenora's hand. The ink had bled slightly, but the words remained clear. The soldier who pulled me from that road did more than save me. He saw a face that should not have been there. If his memory returns, they will understand why I chose him. Gideon read it twice, then a third time. The room seemed to tilt very slightly, though he knew it was only his body reacting. He had long suspected Lenora chose him partly because of that day. But now he understood the second layer. She had not just needed a trustworthy heir. She had needed someone tied by witness, even broken witness, to what had frightened her. Elliot watched him from across the table. You remember anything? Not enough. That's a dangerous amount. Gideon almost said something sharp. Instead, he looked toward the window. Outside, the orchard had entered bloom almost overnight. White apple blossoms covered the rows in a brightness too pure for the dirt beneath them. Asher moved through the falling petals, nose to the ground, then paused and turned back toward the house. For one impossible second, he looked almost young, all grace and alertness and patient faith, and the sight hit Gideon harder than anything on the page. A place like this should have belonged to healing. Instead, it had become a hiding place. By dusk, everyone had gone except Elliot, who stayed because leaving would have meant admitting the story no longer belonged to him. June took copies of the relevant dates. Wes drove away in silence, heavy enough to mean he would either return with more honesty or never return at all. Gideon and Elliot were in the greenhouse after dark, sorting seed trays and boxed documents away from the drafty corner heater, when Asher gave a low sound from the doorway. Not alarm. Attention. A second later, Gideon smelled it. Smoke. Thin at first, almost sweet, then wrong. Dry insulation, hot dust, something catching where it should not. He turned fast and saw a pulse of orange flicker behind stacked materials at the far corner of the greenhouse. "Elliot!" he shouted. They moved at once. This was not an explosion, not cinematic fire leaping from every beam. It was worse for being controlled. Someone had chosen a vulnerable point: dry packing material, old wood framing, easy draft, something that could start small, spread fast, and later be blamed on faulty wiring. Gideon grabbed the extinguisher by the door. Elliot hauled seed flats and boxed starts away from the flame with his bare hands until Gideon cursed at him to use the gloves. Asher darted in and out, not recklessly, but with the frantic intelligence of a dog trying to herd two stubborn men away from dying, the stupid kind of death. The fire climbed anyway. Glass cracked with small gunshot pops. Smoke curled black across the roof beams. Elliot yanked one crate too quickly, hissed, and dropped it, his right hand blistering where heat bit through skin. Then, in the churning orange light, something in Gideon's mind finally tore loose. Not the whole memory, just one clean shard. Lenora on that road years ago, face gray with dust, dragging the wounded child, turning back and shouting a name above the rotor thunder, not at Gideon, not at the child, but toward a man at the edge of the chaos. A name that now came back with brutal, undeniable clarity. "Nolan!" The word left Gideon's mouth before he knew he had spoken. Elliot stared at him through the smoke. The flames hissed upward. Asher barked sharply from the doorway, driving them back toward air and darkness and the cold night beyond the greenhouse walls. And there, under a sky filled with stars too distant to help anyone, Gideon stood breathing smoke and memory together, knowing at last that the name was real. Not proof, but real. The morning after the greenhouse fire began, with the smell of wet ash. It clung to the orchard long after the flames were gone. It drifted through the bright northern air in thin, bitter threads, settling over the gravel drive, the blackened corner of the greenhouse, the porch rails, the damp cuffs of Gideon's old tactical shirt. The sun still rose. The apple trees still held their white blossoms like late snow. The lake still shone with that impossible, indifferent beauty only northern water seemed capable of. But something had changed in the way the land felt. Until now, the danger had stayed half inside hints. Now it had touched the boards, the glass, the air they breathed. Gideon stood outside the damaged greenhouse with a pry bar in one hand, and soot ground into the lines of his palms. His face was clean-shaven as always, but smoke had left a dark shadow along his jaw and cheekbones that made him look harsher than usual. He had slept barely 2 hours. His gray-blue eyes were bloodshot, not from tears, but from fumes and vigilance. He moved with the narrow, tightly controlled precision of a man whose body wanted either action or violence, and was refusing both through sheer discipline. Asher stayed near his left leg. The German shepherd's yellow and black coat had caught soot along one shoulder, and across the black saddle of his back. Gideon had brushed him down twice already. Still, the dog smelled faintly of smoke and wet earth. His amber-brown eyes missed nothing. He was tired too, but the tiredness in him lived under training and devotion. He kept scanning the orchard, the road, the tree line, then checking Gideon again, as though making sure the fire had not burned something invisible inside the man that could not be put out with water. Elliot came up from the lower cabin holding his right hand stiffly away from his body. He had wrapped the burn himself, badly, but with determination. His denim jacket hung open over yesterday's dark Henley, and he looked even thinner in the harsh daylight, the angles of his face made sharper by exhaustion. But he also looked more grounded than he had when he first arrived, as though shared work and shared danger had driven a spike into the soil under his boots. "You should have had that looked at," Gideon said, nodding at the bandage. Elliot shrugged. "It'll blister. Then it'll be ugly. Family tradition." Gideon would have answered with something dry if the situation had been gentler. Instead, he said, "You good to help?" Elliot looked at the scorched greenhouse frame. "I'm already helping." That was not friendship. It was something more useful. By mid-morning June, Mercer arrived with coffee, burn ointment, and a yellow legal pad full of notes. She got out of her Jeep with the same clipped energy she brought to everything, her work jacket zipped high against the cold, and her hair tied back in a knot that had half escaped in the wind. Her narrow face held no softness for pity, but her eyes took in details fast. The damage pattern, the angle of the burn marks, the way the char traveled along one wall and not the other. "This wasn't random," she said after 10 seconds. "No," Gideon replied. June crouched near the far corner where the fire had started. Somebody picked the driest stack in the warmest weak point and gave it time to breathe. She stood. Then they made sure it could still pass as electrical trouble to anyone lazy enough. Elliot gave a short, bitter laugh. "You make sabotage sound like bookkeeping." June glanced at him. "Most dirty work is." She handed him a tin of salve for the burn, without making a ceremony of kindness. Then she spread the legal pad across the hood of her Jeep and began showing Gideon and Elliot what she had connected overnight. Delivery records, shoreline rentals, seasonal timing, utility interruptions, names of cabins rented under cash or initials that matched nobody local. It was June's particular gift. She remembered patterns the way other people remembered songs. "These rentals," she said, tapping 3 dates, "cluster around freeze periods. 2 were booked by out-of-town names that don't exist in county tax or license records. 1 utility drop on the Pike side happened same week as an overnight delivery. Another the winter before. Lenora may not have known the whole mechanism, but she was tracking rhythm. Wes Harlan arrived not long after, hat in hand for once, and that alone told Gideon something had shifted in the man. Wes looked older in remorse than he had in secrecy. The deep weather lines in his face seemed carved wider. His gray-brown stubble had gone uneven, as though he had shaved halfway and lost his nerve. He stood broad and worn in his old canvas jacket and work pants, boots muddy from his own place, hands hanging at his sides with the helpless heaviness of someone who had run out of excuses and found no relief in that. "I need to say something clean," he said. No one interrupted. "Lenora asked me last winter to move some records and a couple tapes. Not to destroy 'em, just move 'em. Said if anything happened, there were places the wrong people would look first." He swallowed once. "I should have asked more. I didn't. I should have gone to somebody outside the county. I didn't. You want a noble reason? I ain't got one. I was scared. His voice did not rise. That made it more believable. I got a wife with bad lungs, he continued. A daughter 2 towns over. Grandkids. Fear will teach a man to call cowardice prudence if he says it enough years in a row. Elliot looked away, jaw hard. Gideon did not forgive him, but he understood him. Where'd you move them? Gideon asked. Wes lifted his eyes. Boathouse, under the floor in the rear service bay. Lenora said if anyone ever needed the rest, they'd know how to listen first. That afternoon, they went down together. The boathouse felt colder than the air outside. It smelled of rope, damp timber, machine oil, and old lake water. Sunlight came through the slats in narrow beams, striping the warped floorboards. Asher moved ahead of them, not sniffing frantically, just working the space with methodical seriousness. His nails clicked once on the wood. Then he paused near the rear wall where a workbench leaned crooked beneath hanging lantern hooks. There, underneath loose planks, Wes helped pry free. They found the hidden compartment. Inside was a sealed canvas packet, 2 tapes wrapped in wax paper, and a thin folder of copied documents. June took the papers first. Elliot took 1 tape. Gideon held the other. The copied documents did not reveal an empire. They revealed something meaner because it was smaller. A supply clerk, a transport handler, a relative tied by marriage into local property interests around the lake. Missing equipment flagged but never pursued hard enough. Freight codes altered just enough to redirect small, deniable loads. Nothing grand, nothing movie-like. Just corruption reduced into practical pieces that could travel quietly from a war zone into civilian hands and then keep earning money in colder, calmer places. Nolan's brother-in-law, June said after reading 1 page twice, used to do contract movement through overseas support lines. Retired here. Died 3 years ago, that's the bridge. Wes nodded slowly. And Nolan stayed useful on this side. Elliot swore under his breath. Gideon said nothing. He was staring at the tape in his hand. They played the shorter tape in the cabin just before dusk. Lenora's voice came through older, weaker than before, but remarkably steady. There was no panic in it, only fatigue and the strange peace of someone who has finally accepted that the truth may outlive her only if she sets it down plainly. If you are hearing this, she said, then someone braver than I was in my last months has decided the land deserves more than fear. The room went still. Even Elliot stopped pacing. Then Lenora added softer, and if Asher is there beside Gideon, tell him I was right about the dog. Gideon's head came up sharply. He had never told Lenora the dog's name. No one in the room spoke for several seconds. Asher, lying near the stove, lifted his head at the sound of his own name and looked toward the recorder with calm, intelligent eyes, as though whatever boundary separated the living from the dead was not nearly as absolute to dogs as men like to imagine. The moment passed, but it left something behind, an odd, aching certainty that Lenora had seen them both more clearly than either had known. The tape went on. Lenora explained in plain terms what Gideon had only half guessed. Nolan Reed was not a mastermind. He was a local hinge. The corruption had roots in wartime logistics, but here it had shrunk into something easier to hide. Quiet transfers, forged storage records, movement of equipment and papers through shoreline properties during seasons when the lake itself covered tracks better than any accomplice. Men like Nolan thrived because they were ordinary enough to be underestimated and official enough to look beyond suspicion. Then came the line that struck Gideon deepest. I did not choose you only because you once saved me, Lenora said. I chose you because I believed a man who has seen war closely and still keeps tenderness for a loyal creature may yet be trusted to guard a place meant for life. No one moved. Elliot stared at the floorboards. June folded her arms tightly across her chest. Wes shut his eyes once, briefly, like a man accepting a sentence long deferred. The rest of the evening sharpened into action. June made copies of everything and drove one set to a friend in Ashland who had contacts beyond county reach. Wes took another set to hide off property with his daughter. Gideon kept the originals and began quietly changing his own patterns. Where he parked the truck, how he approached the road, what doors he left apparently unsecured. He was not baiting anyone yet. He was reducing angles. Nolan came by the next morning. He wore concern like a well-tailored coat. His uniform was immaculate again, hat level, badge polished. He asked to inspect the greenhouse. He asked if Gideon wanted an incident report. He asked where exactly the fire had begun, what had been moved, what records might have been damaged. Everything about him was proper, too proper. Asher was on the porch before Gideon opened the door fully. The shepherd stepped forward and gave, for the first time, a low, unmistakable growl. Not loud, not dramatic, just a sound from deep in the chest, enough to draw a line. Nolan stopped at the threshold. His face barely changed, but something in the eyes cooled. "Seems your dog's decided he doesn't care for me," he said. "He's careful," Gideon replied. "That so?" "Usually for a reason." Nolan smiled then, but it was smaller than before. "Well, be careful yourself, Mr. Vale. Land this size can make a man misread things when he's tired." That afternoon, Gideon found the lock on the lower tool shed scraped and bent. That evening, his truck felt wrong on the road, and after checking beneath it, he found the brake line tampered with. Not severed, not obvious, just loosened enough to turn downhill speed into a prayer. The next night, Elliot came back from town with a split lip and bruising at the jaw, claiming he'd slipped behind Mercer's store. June looked him over once and said flatly, "No, you didn't." Elliot spat blood into the sink and didn't argue. The worst came 2 mornings later. Asher nosed around the orchard's northern edge and stopped near a patch of grass beside the fence. There, left in plain sight, was a lump of meat slick with something chemical and bitter-smelling. The dog leaned in, inhaled, and stepped back at once, lips tightening, ears going flat with disgust. Gideon saw red for one dangerous second. He picked up the bait with gloved hands and bagged it. When he stood, his whole body had gone cold with the kind of anger that made men overcorrect into ruin. Asher pressed against his leg hard enough to shift him. Not fear, not comfort, restraint. Gideon looked down at the dog and drew one long breath until the shaking in his hands stopped. That night the confrontation came. Fog rolled off the lake after sundown, thick and low, blurring the orchard rows and turning the shoreline into a world made of breath and pale shapes. Gideon had guessed Nolan would not risk broad daylight again if he suspected the evidence was spreading. Men who lived by control hated witnesses, but feared exposure more. So Gideon chose the dock road and the old shoreline path and let the dark do what it had always done for him: simplify. He did not go out like a hero in a story. He went out like a man who knew terrain, timing, and how to remain still longer than the other person expected. Asher worked ahead in careful arcs, checking scent on wet grass and weathered posts. Twice he redirected Gideon with the smallest motion of his body. Once he froze, then eased sideways, and a second later a shape moved through the fog where Gideon had almost stepped. Nolan. The sheriff was stripped of his civic polish by the mist. No hat, dark jacket, flashlight off. Just a man with a gun and the confidence of someone who had gotten away with enough to believe he still controlled the ending. "Should have sold," Nolan called through the fog. Gideon stayed behind the cover of the boathouse corner. "Should have stayed a sheriff." Nolan laughed once. "You don't have enough. You got stories, a dead woman's suspicions, and a head full of combat ghosts." He was partly right, which was why Gideon did not advance on rage. He moved him with silence, angles, and pressure. A scrape of boot on old boards, a shifted shadow, a calculated absence. Nolan turned twice toward the wrong sound, once toward the wrong opening. Then Asher gave one short bark from the reeds to the left, pulling Nolan's aim aside just long enough for Gideon to close distance and knock the gun hand wide without firing. The struggle was fast and ugly. No speeches, no choreography. Mud, breath, elbow, wood. The grunt of a man losing the advantage he expected to keep. Nolan tried to drive Gideon backward off the dock edge. Gideon nearly answered with too much force. Asher hit him in the thigh from the side. Not attacking, just enough contact to break the red surge climbing into his vision. That saved more than Nolan. By the time headlights appeared on the upper road, June returning with help called from outside the county, Nolan had broken free and vanished into the fog and pines. He ran. He did not win. He ran. Near midnight, after the deputies from the next jurisdiction had taken statements and June had finally stopped looking at Gideon like she meant to chain him to the porch for his own good, Gideon returned to the main cabin. On the front door, written in thick black marker across a scrap of board wired to the handle, was a message. "This land has buried more than you think." Gideon stood in the porch light, reading at once while Asher sat beside him, silent and steady. It was a threat. It was also confirmation. Lenora had not imagined any of it, and Gideon, at last, knew he was no longer trying to decide whether the darkness under the orchard was real. Now he was deciding what kind of man he would be while bringing it into the light. In the weeks after Nolan Reed disappeared into the fog, the orchard did not become easy. It became honest. That was different. The county investigation widened quietly, then widened again. Not with flashing lights and television vans, not with some grand public unmasking that would have felt too theatrical for a place like Bayfield, but with paperwork, interviews, copied records, call logs, and property searches. Men from outside the county came and went in unmarked vehicles. The local papers printed cautious language. Names were not spoken loudly at first, but facts, once they found enough hands willing to hold them, stopped acting like rumors and started acting like weight. Nolan Reed's badge did not survive the month. Neither did the usefulness of a few men who had spent years standing just close enough to wrongdoing to profit from it without ever seeming dirty. Some of the local chain came loose quickly once the pressure shifted. Others held on longer. That was the nature of rot in small places. It did not spread with drama. It settled in quietly, disguised as ordinary necessity, until good people became tired enough to live beside it. The orchard still owed money. The greenhouse still wore one scorched corner like a black scar. The north fence needed rebuilding. The lower cabin leaked under hard rain. There were taxes, repair costs, replacement glass panels, feed, fuel, medical bills for the bees, and more labor than one man could carry without breaking something important in himself. But Gideon was no longer one man facing too much land. That changed everything. By early summer, Wes Harlan began showing up at first light twice a week and staying until the shadows lengthened over the rows. He no longer moved like a man dodging his own conscience. He moved like a man doing penance with both hands. He brought fence posts, old tools, a flatbed trailer full of salvaged lumber, and the kind of practical knowledge that only age and repetition can teach. In daylight, with his cap pushed back and the wind flattening his graying stubble against his jaw, Wes looked less like a keeper of secrets and more like what he had probably been before fear thinned him out. A decent man who had failed once in a deep way and intended not to fail the same way twice. He did not apologize often. That was not his language. Instead, he worked until sweat darkened his flannel and his palms bled through old calluses. It meant more. June Mercer became something harder to name. She was still the sharp-eyed woman from the supply store, still lean and brisk and impossible to fool for long, but the orchard began to enter her life the way weather enters old wood. Slowly, then all at once. She used her contacts with small distributors to get Gideon fairer rates on seed trays, replacement greenhouse latches, and boxed glass. She connected him with a regional produce buyer who liked straight talk more than polished numbers. She came by to help sort Lenora's remaining records, to estimate what could be sold in season, what needed preserving, what could wait. In work clothes and early morning light, with her hair tied back and freckles showing faintly across her nose, she seemed less like a businesswoman and more like someone the place itself had been waiting for. Elliot stayed. Not because reconciliation made a prettier story, not because he had suddenly turned noble. He stayed because leaving again would have meant repeating the same wound until it became his only shape. There were mornings when Gideon still woke to the sound of Elliot cursing at plumbing, fence wire, or his own bad decisions. There were afternoons when the younger man's temper flashed hot and fast, then burned itself out in 10 minutes of shame-faced silence. But under it all, there was change. He began repairing the smaller cabin with care instead of resentment. He learned Lenora's old guest ledger system and adapted it for short trial stays. He fixed window frames, restained porch rails, and once spent an entire evening sanding rough cedar until his burned hand shook with pain, because, as he muttered, "If people are coming here to breathe, they shouldn't get splinters from the damn railing." It was the closest thing Gideon had heard to devotion in another man's voice. Asher moved through those weeks like a steady current running beneath everything. The German Shepherd was never sentimental. He did not suddenly become playful because the danger had lessened. He remained what he had always been: alert, disciplined, intelligent, deeply bonded to Gideon, and quietly invested in the order of the place. He trotted the orchard rows in the morning. He lay in the doorway during repairs, watching both yard and room. He accompanied Wes to the fence line, June to the greenhouse, Elliot to the lower cabin, always with the same grave courtesy he extended to people he had decided were permitted near his man. Sometimes, when Gideon stopped moving for too long, and old thoughts tried to drag him somewhere dark, Asher would simply lean against his leg until the moment passed. That, too, was a kind of prayer. In late June, Ruth Pike came with a long cardboard document tube, a peach pie, and the expression of a woman who had decided enough waiting had been done. She remained a small, straight-backed figure wrapped in cardigans and practical shoes, her white hair neat, her fine-lined face as precise as ever. Time had not softened Ruth so much as clarified her. She was kinder now that there was less to fear, but not less sharp. "This is for you," she told Gideon, setting the tube on the kitchen table. "Lenora left instructions that I was to hand it over only when I believed you'd stopped behaving like a temporary guest." Gideon almost smiled. "And have I?" "No," Ruth said dryly, "but you've become a useful one." Inside the tube was a letter, sealed in heavy cream paper, and beneath it a rolled sign design sketched in Lenora's hand. Gideon did not open the letter immediately. He carried it all day in his pocket while replacing porch boards and helping Wes reset a sagging fence post. Some things needed labor before they could be read. That evening, after June had gone and Elliot was still down at the lower cabin, fighting with a warped screen door, Gideon sat alone on the porch and opened it. Lenora's handwriting was weaker than in her earlier notes, but it had the same unmistakable steadiness of thought. She wrote that the orchard had never been meant as an ordinary business alone. She wrote that the land, the greenhouse, the bees, the cabins, and the lakeside trails were part of a larger hope. She had wanted to create a place where people could come back from interior ruin without being asked to explain it too quickly. A place for veterans, for retired working dogs, for people whose nervous systems no longer trusted cities, noise, or crowds. A place where one could prune trees, mend fences, care for hives, walk in cold morning light, and be reminded by the work of earth that life was not only memory. She admitted plainly that land could not heal everything. But land, she wrote, forced a person into the present. Soil had no interest in your past story. Bees required calm hands now. Broken glass demanded repair now. Trees needed pruning now, or they would thicken in the wrong direction. The earth does not rescue us, she wrote. It simply refuses to let us hide from the hour we are standing in. For some wounded people, that is the beginning of mercy. Gideon read the line twice. Then he looked out over the orchard and felt, for one quiet second, the kind of grief that arrives only when a person realizes someone understood him long before he believed he could be understood at all. A week later, while clearing out one of the old storage rooms beside the honey shed, Gideon found something so small it should not have struck him as deeply as it did. It was a narrow wooden box, tucked high on a shelf behind empty jars and a rusted smoker lid. Inside lay 3 dog tags, not military tags, but brass nameplates from old working collars. 2 belonged to dogs Gideon did not know. The third was blank. Underneath them was a folded note from Lenora. For the one who arrives before the others, know they were expected. Gideon stood very still. Asher, who had followed him in and was nosing at the lower shelves for mice or history, looked up when he heard the paper unfold. Sunlight from the doorway fell across the dog's face, catching in his amber eyes and along the dark line of his muzzle. He looked, suddenly and strangely, not like an animal passing through a story, but like a companion who had been written into it from the beginning. Gideon rested his fingers over the blank nameplate and understood something without needing it explained. Lenora had not only imagined a place for wounded people, she had imagined their dogs arriving first, holding the line until their humans were ready to believe in shelter again. By late summer, the orchard had a shape no longer held together by defiance alone. The worst of the greenhouse repairs were done. New glass shimmered where blackened panels had once stood. June helped Gideon set up a realistic planting schedule for herbs and late-season starts instead of the impossible ideal Lenora had dreamed of in healthier years. Wes rebuilt the north fence with Elliot, grumbling through every board and staying until the job was truly straight. A retired beekeeper from outside town, Walter Baines, began visiting on Saturdays to help Gideon learn the hives. Walter was 70 if he was a day, thick through the middle and bent slightly at the waist from a life spent over boxes and frames. He had a cloud of white hair circling a sunburned scalp, a walrus mustache stained faintly by coffee, and broad hands astonishingly gentle with bees. He spoke slowly, as though words were another tool best used with intention. When he smiled, the whole left side of his face folded more deeply than the right, due to an old stroke that had not taken his wit with it. "Bees no fear," Walter told Gideon one warm morning while lifting a frame heavy with gold and movement. "They don't mind grief much, but fear makes people jerky, and jerky gets you stung." Gideon glanced at Asher, who sat just beyond the hives with perfect stillness, watching clouds of bees move around him without snapping once. Walter chuckled. "Dogs got better manners than half the men I taught." The first guests came in early autumn. Not many, just enough to test whether Lenora's idea could survive contact with actual wounded human beings. Elliot listed the smaller cabin quietly through a veterans recovery network June had found through one of her distributors. He kept the descriptions simple: quiet orchard, lake access, work welcome but not required, dogs permitted. The first man to arrive was named Daniel Mercer, not related to June despite the shared surname, though the coincidence amused no one enough to mention it twice. Daniel was in his late 40s, broad in the chest, but gone soft around the middle from too many years of carrying invisible weight instead of useful loads. His close-cropped hair had gone mostly gray, and a jagged scar ran behind one ear and disappeared into his collar. He spoke politely, barely. His eyes were the hollow blue of a man who had left part of himself in a desert and learned to call the missing space normal. With him came an old black lab named Mercy, muzzle silvered, hips stiff, tail slow but determined. Gideon expected awkwardness. What he did not expect was the sight the next morning. Daniel standing wordless among the apple rows with a picking bag over one shoulder, while Mercy sniffed the grass and Asher walked beside the older dog at a patient, deliberate pace, matching her slowed step as if he understood dignity required adjustment. Gideon watched from the porch. Something in his chest eased that had been tight for years. It was not triumph. It was not healing in any dramatic sense. It was recognition. Lenora had seen farther than the end of her own life. By the time the apples turned deep red and the air sharpened with the first true hint of frost, the new sign was ready. Elliot and Wes set the posts. June painted the final coat. Ruth brought hot cider and stood back, pretending not to wipe her eyes when no one looked directly at her. The sign read, "Pike Lantern Orchard. For the lost who still choose to stay." The words stood at the entrance in dark lettering against pale wood, simple enough to look like they had always belonged there. On the afternoon the sign went up. Gideon sat on the porch steps after supper with Lenora's final letter in his hands. Inside the house he could hear the ordinary, nearly sacred sounds of life. Elliot arguing mildly with June over inventory numbers, Ruth laughing once at something Walter had said, dishes touching, a chair scraping, floorboards answering under boots. Asher lay against Gideon's leg, the shepherd's coat warm from the last sunlight. There were the faintest touches of gray beginning around his muzzle now, hardly visible unless the light struck right. His eyes, though, remained bright and quiet. The eyes of a dog who knew his territory, his purpose, and the man he belonged to. Gideon looked at the last lines of Lenora's letter. "Some people do not need to be rescued again," she had written. They only need to be given a place where their hearts no longer have to stand watch all night. He lowered the page and looked out across the orchard. The lake beyond the trees held the late light in broad bands of silver blue. Apples glowed red among the branches. Smoke from the chimney rose straight into the evening like a thin blessing. Somewhere down near the lower cabin, Mercy barked once in her old rusty voice, and Asher's ears twitched, though he did not rise. For the first time in many years, Gideon understood that what had returned to him was not his past. It was his capacity to belong somewhere without apology. He put the letter aside, rested one hand lightly on Asher's neck, and spoke toward the house, the orchard, the lake, and whatever quiet mercy had led him here through all the dark roads before. "All right," he said softly. "I'm staying." And the wind moved through the apple trees like 1,000 small hands, turning the pages of a life that had finally chosen to continue. Sometimes they come quietly, like a dog who refuses to leave your side, like a piece of land waiting for the right wounded soul to return, like a door opening at the exact moment a person is almost ready to give up. Gideon believed his life had been broken by war, loss, and years of wandering. He thought the best parts of him had been left behind somewhere far from home. But this story reminds us of something beautiful and deeply true. God does not waste pain, and He does not forget the people the world has learned to overlook. What seemed like an old inheritance was really an invitation. What looked like a burden became a calling. What felt like the end of one man's story became the beginning of healing for many others. That is often how God works in real life. Not always through loud wonders, not always through instant rescue, but through quiet mercy, through faithful animals, through strangers who remember our goodness when we have forgotten it ourselves, through second chances hidden inside ordinary work, ordinary places, and ordinary days. Maybe the miracle in this story was not only that Gideon found a home. Maybe the miracle was that, after everything he had seen, his heart was still capable of staying open. Maybe the miracle was that God had been preparing a place for him long before he was ready to believe he deserved one. And that truth reaches into everyday life, too. There are people all around us carrying silent battles. A neighbor, a veteran, a widow, a tired parent, a person who smiles in public and falls apart in private. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness, the phone call we almost do not make, the patience we almost do not offer, the help we almost do not give, can become the turning point in someone else's life. We may never see the full harvest of one good act, but God sees it. He remembers it. And in His perfect timing, He can grow something beautiful from what looked lost. So the lesson of this story is simple, but powerful. Do not give up on people too soon. Do not believe that broken seasons are the end. Do not underestimate what God can do with one faithful heart, one loyal companion, one place of rest, and one decision to keep going. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us, what quiet blessing or unexpected mercy has God placed in your life? And if you want more stories of faith, healing, courage, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us on this journey. May God bless every person watching. May He bring peace to troubled hearts, rest to tired minds, healing to old wounds, and light to every home. May He protect those who feel alone, strengthen those who are carrying silent pain, and guide every wandering soul toward the place where they truly belong. and may the Lord watch over you and your family tonight and always.